Welcome again to Research Day 2017. This afternoon we are having a panel discussion under the theme Local Advent and Human Rights. That is the theme Polygraph Testing or Lie-Detector Testing, Local Advent and Human Rights. That's the theme for the panel discussion. And we have 7 very qualified panelists to lead the discussion, and they will present for between 5 and 10 minutes so that we, at the end, would have, we the audience, would have a chance to continue the discussion and interrogation. I'll just quickly indicate who the 7 panelists are. We're going to start with Captain Bewry, and he is an associate member of the American Polygraph Association and a founding member of the Jamaican Polygraph Association. We start with him because no doubt he will give some overview of the history and development of polygraph testing in Jamaica and the region. We also have Michael Thompson, Detective Sergeant Michael Thompson of the Major Organized Crime Organization, MOCA. Presently, he serves as one of the senior forensic polygraph examiner and is second in command at the JCF's Polygraph Unit. Right, so we have Michael Thomas from the Major Organized Crime. And next we have Professor Garth who, again, we have a long bio, but for our purposes, he has substantial training in statistics and psychometrics and experience as a statistician and program evaluation specialist. One of the issues that will arise in the discussion is the relation between polygraph testing and psychometric testing in organizations. And we expect Professor Lips to deal with some of the issues of that relationship. Gregory Reid, an attorney at law and a specialist practitioner in labor law and industrial relations. And I like to read this part because I'm not the only old man here with over 35 years of experience. Grace Martin Hall is here. She is currently the managing director and senior consultant of GMH Consultants Limited, Kingston. Additionally, she is an adjunct senior lecturer and PhD supervisor, primarily in the Human Resource, the MSc Graduate Programs Unit at the University of the West Indies. And on another one of our panelists, which is Ainsley Shakes, he is the chief forensic polygraphist. The panel is finally made up of Professor Wendel Abel. Everybody knows Professor Abel, consultant psychiatrist at the University Hospital of the West Indies and head of the Department of Community Health and Psychiatry. So that we're going to start with, as you said, the association, the Polygraph Association of Jamaica. We'll hear from the captain, and then we will take it from there.
Master of Ceremonies, fellow panelists, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon. Today, you no doubt will hear arguments that the polygraph is unable to detect lies, that truthful members of socially stigmatized groups are at risk of producing false positives, that psychopaths and sociopaths will produce false negatives, and that there are various countermeasures one can use to beat the test. The truth be told, if that was the sum total of the case, I would have been out of business long ago. I too, like many of you present, was skeptical of the polygraph's claim, but having been trained by the world's foremost expert in forensic psychophysiology and having administered over 7,000 tests over the last 18 years, I can honestly say that although it's not infallible, it is between 85 and 95% accurate in detecting lies, once in the hands of a competent polygrapher. In other words, the polygraph is as good as the examiner. What, however, is not in dispute is that the polygraph instrument is built for purpose, as it records the relative changes in an examinee's blood pressure, heartbeat, respiration, and perspiration. The underlying assumption is that certain types of questions on the polygraph test will trigger the body's flight-fight response to a perceived threat or danger. This, I might add, is aptly described in Proverbs 28, verse 1. The wicked flee when no one pursueth, the righteous is as bold as a lion. During this psychophysiological reaction, certain hormones like adrenaline and cortisol are released into the bloodstream, speeding the heart rate, slowing digestion, shunting blood flow to major muscle groups, and giving the body a burst of energy and strength. Whereas there is a distinct difference between general nervousness and fear, where there is, however, room for error is during the preparation of the actual test and the interpretation of the chart data. Although the polygraph test results are not at present admissible in Jamaican courts, however, the confessions that are often obtained through its use are admissible. This is particularly useful when many of the persons who fail give incriminating evidence. With over 80 companies regularly using my services, I am uniquely placed to report that our fellow countrymen and women are both our greatest asset and worst liability, as employee theft accounts for almost 90% of my caseload and represent a significant threat to good governance. I can also attest that the typical company loses 5% of its revenue each year to internal theft, that 75% of all employees have stolen from their employer at least once, and that half of those are repeat offenders, that employees over 60 steal on average 28 times more in value than those under 25, that owners and executives account for 19% of all fraud, but steal 4 times more in value than middle managers, that middle managers account for 36% of all frauds and steal 2 times more in value than the rank and file workers, who account for 42% of all frauds, that 3/4 of all frauds are committed by male employees, and that losses suffered by men are 4 times higher than females, that fraudulent schemes last on average a year and a half before being detected, and 40% are discovered through tips and 20% by chance, that 58% of victim organizations fail to recover any of their losses, with only 14% making full recovery, and that 33% of business bankruptcies are caused by employee theft. In light of these sobering statistics, which are not mine, but that of the Association of Certified Fraud Examiners, it is my firm opinion that the polygraph can play an important role in the management of ordinary contractual relations and in the optimal operation of one's business. In cases of theft and other acts of dishonesty, employers often have to determine who is guilty and innocent without the benefit of formal criminal investigation and prosecution, or make a judgment call as to who is fit and proper. In such circumstances, provided an examinee is willing to give their written consent, a polygraph can be administered for pre-employment screening and a wide range of investigative purposes. My only caveat is that no adverse decision ought to be taken based wholly and solely on a polygraph test result. I thank you.
The previous speaker made a strong case for polygraph testing. And I'm sure as we continue, you probably will hear different views. I hope at the end of the day you don't ask for the speakers to be subjected to the test. But the question I want to pose is, does the test detect lies or test for lies, or can it lie on us? And before I proceed, and I think we're going to have a lot of overlap here, I probably want to invite you to come forward to answer a few questions for me. Would you want to come? This lady here, yes. No. And as I ask you, tell me how you're feeling. I mean, when I asked you the question, did you feel your heart racing? You felt yours racing, right? You felt it. And I didn't ask the question. Yes? Did you feel your hand trembling a little bit? No? You did, right? All right, you're helping me. Did you find that your respiration, you were breathing a little faster? You're saying yes. And I didn't plant her in the audience, you know. She's answering, right? And I raise this point because most of us, I mean, understanding the test, it's essentially a test that the basis of the test is that a person would be asked questions. And I think you may be getting a demonstration today. You ask a number of questions, and it can trigger the response in the body, which is we describe as a physiological response. And there are several organs that we target in the test. One of them would be the heart. You know, when we're anxious, the heart races. Some people may race so fast, they describe that as palpitation. When we're anxious or when we're under pressure, we begin to breathe fast. It's almost as if you think that somebody is about to attack you, you're under stress. Your blood pressure will increase, and of course, you begin to sweat a little bit more. And these are some of the responses that the test seeks to capture. Now, the question is, if these things happen, I mean, regularly, if speaker asks you to come forward and you get anxious and your body begin to give you these responses, yes? You ask to just come forward. If you probably put before a machine and know that they're going to test whether you're telling lie or not, and if the machine gives a particular reading, you probably could lose your job or you end up in jail and so on. That the point we're asking is, does the machine by itself or sitting before that machine generate anxiety and these bodies' response? And the question is raised as to how accurate it is. And that's a question I'd like to pose, because there are some persons who are advocate for polygraph testing, and they suggest that, look, yes, it's accurate, and accuracy may be as high as 90%, anywhere between 80 to 90%. There are some persons who challenge it and say, well, it's not a very valid, accurate test. And I'm sure Professor Lips will be addressing some of those issues. I am just I'm just representing the voices here, you know, as a psychiatrist, you know, and trying to sift through, I mean, what may be right, what may be wrong, and to set us thinking, because I'm certainly not an authority in the area. But so there are persons who challenge it and say it's not accurate. It may not really be testing whether somebody is lying, because people who are honest can probably do the test And because they're anxious and worried, you know, you're a good Christian and you're on the job, and people are accusing you of committing fraud, and you realize that you may lose your job, and you have this machine before you with all of these gadgets and so on. And when you see the machine, it reminds you probably of 3 weeks ago when family member had a heart attack and you were anxious and concerned and so on. And just the sight of this machine and the thought of losing your job and all of that stuff, and you have your child in university whose college education is to be paid, and you're a good Christian, you know you never lied, but just sitting before that machine, can it? Some people advocate that the anxiety may trigger the response and the test may actually indicate that you're actually lying. And then there are some people who say that, well, on the other hand, there are people who are dishonest. And, you know, that seasonal person, that person who's been good at stealing, scamming, whatever, and they go before the machine and they're able to control their anxiety level. They know how to breathe properly and to relax themselves and control their blood pressure. So when the machine is linked up to them, the reading comes out and it indicates that, you know, blood pressure is not increasing, they're not sweating at all, heart rate is normal. And so the question I'm posing is having put the sides, both sides to the question is, how accurate is this? How useful is it? Can we rely on it? And I'm sure my colleague panelists will try to answer those questions. Thank you.
I am here to talk and address the validity of polygraphs as a psychologist and as someone who is trained in the use of assessment strategies for personnel selection, as well as a psychometrician. And the first point I want to come to address is that there is little logical connection of polygraph testing to deceptive responding. Okay? Polygraph testing is based upon the premise that autonomic physiological responding is linked to these or associated with truthful or deceptive responses. Okay? In fact, there is little logical reason to believe that such an association exists. As Professor Abel has demonstrated, there are many reasons why people may sweat, have an elevated heart rate, other than lying or deception. So there's essentially a near zero correlation. There's no logical basis to expect a connection between physiological responding and truthful responses, okay? In fact, in reviewing the research on polygraph testing and deception, 3 eminent societies, learned societies, have stated that there is little or no evidence that there is an association between physiological responding and deception. Okay? The American Psychological Association, the British Psychological Society, and the National Academy of Sciences have all come out with detailed reports reviewing the evidence on the association and have found there's none. In fact, the National Academy of Sciences, they were charged with the mission of determining whether polygraph tests should be administered to people in the intelligence community. And they said, given what they reviewed, if there was an 80% accuracy rate, and you had to screen 10,000 people, okay? If 10 of the people you were screening were spies, you would detect 8 out of the 10 who were spies. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? But the problem comes up is that you would detect 1,992 people as being deceptive who weren't. You would screen out far more people who were non-deceptive and non-spies than you would actually detect. The efficiency of the procedure is very, very low, as you can see. Okay? And that has to do with a low base rate. Okay? A second issue deals with differences in people's levels of autonomic responding. Some people are prone to very high levels of autonomic responding, and other people are prone to very, very low levels. For example, Ising, in validating his personality measures and in doing research on personality, found that people who were high in extroversion You would probably think they're excitable people, right? Actually, they are people who are very low in autonomic responding. These are people who have to seek out excitement. They have to seek out socialization in order to raise their neurological functioning, their level of autonomic responding to a baseline level that most people have. So they will engage in activities that increase their levels of excitement. And you could probably see some of the associations of that. You know, people who are high in extroversion like to ride roller coasters. They tend to be more prone to speeding, okay? They do a lot of things that are dangerous, just like criminals. In fact, many criminals say the reason they go about crime is the excitement. So what you may be detecting in a polygraph is high levels of extroversion. And what people find who do polygraph testing is, yes, you may feel and believe that you're detecting deceptiveness, but you may be really just detecting high levels of extroversion. And the opposite pattern is true for people who are introverted. They tend to be very high in levels of autonomic responding and have to reduce their baseline rates. Another thing is that multiple studies that have been done have looked at psychopaths. Okay? And psychopaths are a particular problem in organizations. Psychopaths, there's about, I think, a prevalence rate of 1 in every 100. Roughly 1 in every 100 people is a psychopath. And you always think of serial killers, right? People who steal repeatedly. But most psychopaths are not like that. Most of them are called successful psychopaths. These are people who are bright enough to know not to engage in criminal activity. So one of the characteristics of a psychopath is a low level of autonomic responding. It's one of the key characteristics, along with an inability to emotionally connect to people. So what do psychopaths do? I happen to work with a psychopath who's a manager. Okay, yes. And he loved to hire, he would only hire single women, okay, with children. Okay. And things would start off well. And then he'd sort of ask them to stay, you know, after work, you need to do a little bit more. Okay. Kind of hard. And then he'd sort of start criticizing their work. He engaged in a number of activities just to watch and see how much he could make these women squirm. Okay? The organization actually knew he was doing this. But because he was a valued manager, kept him in his post. And whenever these women would get too stressed out, they'd go down to the HR and they'd say, you know, I just can't tolerate working. And the next day, they would be assigned to a new position. And he would be given another panel of people to select. And guess who he would select? Another woman with children. Because, you know, those are people who are less likely to run from the job. Okay? So successful psychopaths get a lot of pleasure out of manipulating people, okay? And here in doing research on kinds of occupations psychopaths engage in or tended to be attracted to, supervisory and managerial positions. He included in a battery of personnel selections, he did this for free, selecting people using psychological assessment methods is very, very expensive. It costs about 1 year's salary. So he volunteered for a variety of companies in the United States and England to do this for them. And in this assessment exercise, he included his measure of psychopathy. Guess what he found? Psychopaths were about twice as likely to apply for and be selected for managerial posts. So if you say your boss is a psychopath, he may truly be one. Okay, so that's kind of something you'd be kind of interested in. Okay, but how does this relate to polygraph tests? Well, because they are less emotionally responsive, okay, it is far harder for you to detect. They have essentially a very low level baseline of responsivity. And the way a polygraph works is you ask a person a question, there's some control questions, then you ask them the threatening question, and you're looking at the difference in pattern. Well, if you have somebody who is low in emotional responsivity, it's going to be very difficult for you to tell the difference between the control questions and the actual threat questions. So the standard method of polygraph examination, which is to ask control questions and then to ask a question about the suspected act. If you have a psychopath, if you have an extrovert, you're not likely to be able to detect the differences. It has to do with the signal-to-noise response. And the opposite is actually true. If you have somebody who's very introverted, they tend to be all over the place in their autonomic responding. So when you compare them, they are people who are likely to be inconclusive. You can't really tell whether they're deceptive or not. Okay? Another issue that comes up with this connection between deceptive responding and responses, this psychophysiological responding is knowledge of guilt. Okay? How many people in this room have ever stolen anything? I'd like to have people raise their hands. Okay? Okay. How many of you have borrowed something without the owner's permission? So you could see there's a dramatic difference. Few people are ever going to admit they stole something. But I can guarantee you, everyone in this audience probably has borrowed something without asking someone's permission. Right? Those people are not likely to feel guilty and are unlikely to have an elevated response. Okay? In fact, when I worked at Statistics Canada, we had to do a survey on criminal behavior. And we were in a position that many other organizations weren't. We had absolute confidentiality. So anything you said to us, we could not report in court. In fact, we were sworn under the Official Secrets Act, and we're actually eligible to be, well, actually, if we broke the act, it was 25 years in hard labor in prison. And we took that oath of confidentiality very seriously. Well, we found that we couldn't ask people about their criminality. We found we had to ask questions such as, how often have you borrowed something without someone's permission? Because people would be more likely to say yes to that question. So, given that fact, if you're asking people, have you ever stolen something? You might or you might not detect someone who's actually stolen something. So the kind of questions you ask and your knowledge of what kinds of questions to ask would be pretty important. Okay. The second issue is the validity of the assessment methods themselves. Okay? Often what polygraph examiners do is like what many people do who are experts in assessment. You do this procedure many, many, many times, okay? And you look at the machine. And you get the idea that, oh yeah, right, I'm going through that. Yes, that's right, he's deceptive, okay? And I knew that beforehand. So what happens over a period of time, people tend to rely more upon their personal judgment in making a decision rather than the machine. So this is being found actually in psychodiagnostic testing. Many clinical psychologists, instead of looking at the pattern of scores, say, right, I'm going to use my clinical intuition in determining whether this person has a disorder. So we know, however, from psychometric research that usually they're wrong. There are better statistical strategies to detect classifications of disorders than expert judgment. So expert judgment is a very poor criterion to use in detecting or making any kind of decision. Okay, so expert opinion often is very prone to error. Okay? Other evidence has suggested that the detection of lies in using polygraphs usually doesn't have anything to do with the polygraph itself. It has to do with what they call the fear factor. So the polygraph examiner will come up and they will give the person some test responses. And they'll say, you see here, You can see how when I ask you a question that you've obviously lied to, your heart rate goes up. Your skin your galvanic skin response, how electrically responsive your skin drops up. Your blood pressure changes. So you see the machine can detect your lies. Okay. Well, often what happens is people say, well, you know, I really did steal. It is not the polygraph that detects theft. It is the interrogation. And they call that the fear factor. In fact, some psychologists and the American Psychological Association has said that polygraph tests really shouldn't be called lie detectors, but fear detectors. Because they're probably better at detecting fear in people than lies. Okay? And I mentioned the problem with signal to noise. If you have somebody at a very low baseline, you kind of have to sort of struggle to see a difference. So the use of the control question technique versus the incident question that they ask depends upon signal to noise detection. But if you have a low level of signal to detect, you know, when you have the control question and you ask the other, you're just going to see a little blip. It's going to be very hard for the machine or the operator to see a distinction. And similarly, for the person who is very very physiologically responsive, you're going to have the same problem. You're not going to be able to distinguish the noise due to the control to the actual guilt. Okay. There is little value in using polygraphs in personnel selection. Okay? And one of the problems with polygraph tests is that they give you 4 responses: deceptive, non-deceptive, inconclusive, and the person didn't finish the test. Okay. Well, that's kind of problematic for personnel selection. In personnel selection, unlike other areas of psychological assessment, you're not looking for a yes-no answer. You're looking for a very narrow level of variability. You're looking for a specific level of intelligence, a specific level of particular personality characteristics, a particular level of aptitudes. So it's very important that your measure be able to detect differences. Okay? If your measure gives you 4 responses, you can't really use that. Okay? So for each occupation, there's a very specific and very narrow range of intelligence, extroversion, stability, which is some people call neuroticism, openness to experience, variety of aptitudes that are associated with being minimally successful in being able to carry out the duties. But the responses you get from a polygraph are yes, no, not a range of responses. Okay? Also, if you think about it, some occupations require deception. Right? In fact, you would think that you would want high levels of integrity in a policeman, right? I mean, it would make sense. And the premise of screening people for the police and screening them for intelligence is you want people of high levels of integrity. But you have these policemen that are undercover operatives. Oh, gee, that would be kind of a problem. Don't you essentially have to deceive people? Don't you have to take on a role and deceive the people you're trying to work with? Another aspect, let's suppose you're a detective and you're investigating a robbery. Okay, what do you want to do? You want to tell the suspect, we know we have evidence. We have evidence, but I can't really tell it right now. But we know you're guilty. And the evidence is going to... They don't know. Being a good interrogator fundamentally relies upon the ability to be deceptive. What about intelligence operatives? Well, the same thing is true for someone who's a spy in a foreign country, right? If you're going to work as a spy for the US Embassy and you go to your job every day, aren't you really going to have to be very good at deception. Okay, so some occupations would require you to be deceptive. And some of those occupations that are actually used to screen out, they may actually be screening out the people they need. Boy, right, that's a small issue. Okay. The other issue is adding polygraph testing to an assessment center. An assessment center is where you have a battery of intelligence, personality tests, etc., adds little incremental validity. Okay? And the reason for that is personality tests assess many of the characteristics associated with criminality. In fact, there's a personality profile. High levels of extroversion, high levels of neuroticism, openness to experience that are associated with criminality. So if you want to predict future criminal behavior, you don't need a polygraph. You can just use a personality test and probably get a better predictive validity. Okay. The other issue, and really a serious danger in the use of polygraph testing in personnel selection, is there is one area of psychology where psychologists are most likely to be sued. And that is if you're an IO psychologist doing personnel selection. What will people attack in a personnel selection process? The psychometric tests that are used, the battery of materials. Well, in order to do this, to make it defensible for an organization, you must have very clear, documented reliability and validity of your measures. However, there is little documented evidence. I'm finishing up, Mr. Branche, very soon. Last point. Little documented evidence for the validity of lie detection in personnel selection. So if you were to actually use this, your whole assessment exercise would likely to be thrown out, costing you 1 year's salary of the person you're hiring. It's a tad bit expensive mistake to make. Okay, I have a bit more, but I won't. I see I've exceeded my time. Thank you very much.
So today we're here to clarify, ventilate, and present empirical evidence on which polygraph stands. Now, the National Research Council, which is the research arm of the National Academies of Science, Engineering, and Medicine in the US, they have done extensive research on polygraph. Emanating from that, the American Polygraph Association in 2011 did a meta-analysis of all the field techniques used in polygraph. So there is scientific evidence, there is scientific basis on which polygraph stands. So contrary to what you might have heard, polygraph examiners do not use judgment in making the assessment. We use validated techniques. Now what the Jamaica Constabulary Forces Polygraph Unit, the techniques we use are validated by the American Polygraph Association. We are accredited by them. And every 2 years, we go for advanced training to maintain our accreditation. So there is a sound construct within which we operate. I earlier heard, well, two of my esteemed panelists, they have spoken to polygraph from their perspective. I earlier heard Ivan Pavlov's classical conditioning theory referred to. When my esteemed panelist, well, he actually pointed to the notion that when you are faced with fear, there are certain physiological manifestations which take place. But there is what we call, emanating from Pavlov's theory, the conditioned response theory is what we use in polygraph, because unconditioned stimulus creates unconditioned responses. So when he pointed to the member in the audience and said, did you feel your heart race? Did you feel your handshake? That is an unconditioned stimulus. In polygraph, we condition the stimulus before it is presented to you, because conditioned stimulus creates a conditioned response. My esteemed panelists, they spoke to the diagnostic aspect of polygraph alone, which in itself is done at the very end of the process. The diagnostic aspect lasts anywhere from 20 to 25 minutes. But there's a 2.5 hour discourse before the actual diagnostic test, during which pertinent information is gleaned from the individual. We have, well, in polygraph, there are different types of tests. In the JCF, 95% of our tests is the screening, the pre-employment screening examination, in which you are sent a polygraph questionnaire prior to your appointment date with 134 questions. So you are aware of the questions before the date of your examination. When you come to the polygraph unit, the examiner goes through those questions with you throughout that 2.5 hour discourse, during which persons have they have volunteered information. So we're not referring to the diagnostic aspect as yet, which my esteemed panelists so eloquently alluded to a while ago. Polygraph is more than just the diagnostic test. We have gotten confessions from individuals during our polygraph process without even employing the diagnostic portion. Presently in the JCF, we are polygraphing every applicant prior to engagement or employment. And you would be amazed at the types of self-disclosures we are getting. So what's the point here? In employee assessment for employment, polygraph plays a very important role, because what it does, it gives you a true picture of who the employee is. Whether it's a potential employee or someone you have working in your organization. Polygraph is like the proverbial fly on the wall, the things you do in secret. Persons come and they tell us. You would be surprised at the things that we are told in polygraph, in that polygraph suite. So in your organization, if you have a sound post-polygraph process, wherein you send your employees to us, and throughout that 2.5 hour discourse, they self-disclose incriminating information, even before the diagnostic test. And that person was up for promotion. Post-polygraph, you have a construct in place where you invite the person in for a discussion, and you inform the individual that based on your self-disclosures, we won't be able to promote you until maybe 1 year's time. During this time, we have you on a probationary period. We're going to watch you, at the end of which we will do a polygraph test since your last test. What that does, it forces the individual to conform to laid down guidelines. And 2, it creates in the mind of the individual that I am redeemable. So even though I was involved in nefarious activities, my employer still sees hope in me. Twofold process, just by virtue of the self-disclosures. So what it does, it acts as a system of deterrence, therefore promoting efficiency in your organization. There is no other method known to man that has this effect on any individual. And there is literature out there to prove all of this. In 2001, Dr. Philip E. Crewson, he did a research on polygraph on the diagnostic aspect now. Let me speak to that. He compared polygraph to other diagnostic tools in terms of accuracy. Polygraph came out on top of the MRI for breast cancer. It came out on top of the assessment used for multiple sclerosis. In terms of inter-rater reliability, where the polygraph examiner is concerned, that same study has proven that the inter-rater reliability for polygraph examiners is much higher than that in medicine and psychology. The literature is out there. So the anecdotal evidence that presents itself, do not be shafted by it, please. The literature is there So what I'm presenting here, it is not my own personal opinion. It is based on scientific evidence. The utility of polygraph will do you great wonders in your organization. Thank you.
From an HR perspective, and I speak from the perspective of the practice of HR and for organizations, it poses quite a dilemma for us. And in many cases, it poses a lot of confusion as well as to whether to use the test or not. Because generally, polygraphing is not used as a best practice. It is not regarded as an HR best practice. And whether to use it for pre-employment screening or whether to use it for post-employment occurrences, the HR practitioners still have quite a dilemma. However, as a result of the changes that are now going on in the landscape, the global changes, and the whole landscape is rapidly changing as far as selection and hiring is concerned, we're having to go back and look at it carefully, because although you may conduct a very good interview, what we're finding is that the quality of the persons who are now coming for interviews are changing rapidly, and we find that there are a lot of clever behaviors. When we look at resumes, we find that there are a lot of omissions, most likely. There are a lot of exaggerations. There are a lot of falsifications. So it is quite a challenge for us to sort out what we call the feckless behaviors. Okay? That is persons who are going to be ineffective when we hire them, persons who are going to be counterproductive, persons who would most likely be dishonest. So when we consider the polygraph, we have a lot of concerns, we have a lot of confusion. Most HR practitioners and some organizations will shy away from using it because the whole landscape with polygraphing has a lot of arguments for, against it. And I'm sure when Mr. Reid comes up, he will be better at explaining than I can ever explain some of the concerns they have from a legal standpoint. However, although it is banned in many countries, in the global context, there are areas that are permissible. And for example, in the US, which is, considered to be the giant for everything that goes well and goes wrong, but does occur, a lot of permissions are given for specific organizations, especially within government, to use polygraphing. So we look at places such as National Defense and Security. Okay? We look at nuclear power areas such as the Department of Energy. And we also look at counterintelligence agencies such as the FBI, etc., where these are the norms. We also look at areas where there's access to highly classified information. And now that we have all WikiLeaks and all of those things, I'm sure the use of it is going to be even more. But we also have other areas that private organizations within the US are allowed to use polygraphing, both for pre-employment screening and whenever there is economic loss within an organization, such as fraud or theft or other occurrences, injuries, etc. Locally here, we have to be careful, although we have examples of it being used, because we still have a law that we must straddle, which is not allowing us necessarily, as far as my research has shown, to use polygraphing properly. The JDF and the JCF would fall under the context of those organizations, say, within the US that are allowed to use it. Hence, you probably all saw the results of a massive screening that the JCF done, where, the paper, I think it was the Observer, published that 108 of the recruits failed the polygraph test. So here locally, yes, I guess in that context, both the JDF and the JCF are being allowed to use it. The business processing industry has been also forced to use the polygraphing test. The call centers, based on the nice publicity that we have been receiving about our corruption and our scamming, etc., are now being forced by the contractors that they work for to use it. So in most cases, a contract coming in, the contract is specifying that all of the employees have to be polygraphed who will work on this contract. And as a matter of fact, that is how I first met Mr. Bewry, because Mr. Bewry was asked to come into one of my clients and actually do the polygraphing so we could qualify for this contract. So a lot of reasons now locally are posing the challenges as to how do we now, fully use polygraphing and use it properly. I was cautioned by the Labor Board, the Ministry of Labor, that no matter what happens, polygraphing will not be used as a basis for dismissal of any employees, even though it may form a very factual basis. So it's telling you that as HR practitioners, we really have a dilemma, because if I have a major case of fraud in my organization or theft or, some other investigation, granted I'm going to use other tools as well, but I'm told that, forget about bringing us the polygraph results, because we are not going to use this as one of the bases for dismissal. Therefore, it is quite important that we exercise some caution as well, as from an HR perspective, when using the polygraphing. We have to ensure that there are sanctions that are properly documented that we may use. We have to really look at how we set policy, okay? I think that is very important for every organization to have a policy, a well-documented policy on both their pre-employment screening as well as post-employment. In the case of the pre-employment screening, I think that even on the application form, there should be a statement on the form that indicates that you may be subject to a polygraph test among the other selection tests that are being done. There should also be very well documented standards as to how this is carried out. Not everybody can conduct a polygraph test. I don't care whether I'm going to send you down to MOCA to be trained by MOCA or so forth. Instead, MOCA should be brought in, but then there are arguments against that, because is that a biased situation where I'm already bringing in the police to come and do a polygraph test before I'm even placed, in front of the court, etc. So therefore, I would probably suggest that you look to somebody like Mr. Bewry or some of the other established. There are quite a few established entities here who are doing polygraphing. I think Guardsman is doing it. And I think there's another entity. There are quite a few entities. But it must be also done with proper control. Because one of the things that I've observed, both during my time in the US and I observed here, is that sometimes the battery of questions that are being used are not relevant to the organization or to the type of industry that we're in. So my suggestion, again, to the practitioners, the experts, is that you need to ensure that there's reliability and relevancy of the battery that is going to be used. The policy must also include consent. I don't care what the occurrence is, but the policy must also include consent by the person that is going to be polygraphed. And it should be written consent. Recently, I came across a situation where there was a wide open occurrence of theft at a managerial level. there was a manager who was actually a manager of a branch location of an organization. And over a period of about 6 or 7 months, he seemed to have helped himself to cash and was able to falsify the end-of-day reports and the monthly reports and stuff without anybody understanding. Now, I went in to do some work in this organization, and one day, after I've observed a couple of things, I said to them, tell me something, do you ever randomly audit your branch locations? And they said, no. I said, but you should. And I just randomly picked a location and said to them, I want you to audit this location this week. And that was the location they went to and actually did a count of the vault. And when they did the count of the vault, they could not balance the cash that was to be on hand by about $1.5 million. Now, when we took the steps to dismiss that employee, I was told that we couldn't dismiss the employee like that because we needed to have a series of hearings with the employee, and that the employee would have to confess to taking this money, etc. So I said, okay, we'll polygraph this person. And I was told, pointless, no use you do that because we're not going to use that. So I was not able to either advise the employer to suspend the person at that time or to terminate the person. The only thing we could do is to put the person on warning that we were going to go on to do further investigations. So we lost about 2 weeks in doing what we had to do because we had to go back and have all of these hearings and stuff. I'm sure Mr. Reid will tell me whether I'm right, wrong, or indifferent in that. But we had to go back now and have all of these hearings, and we just didn't even bother to use the polygraph because it's quite expensive. So why am I going to use it and then it is not admissible or I can't do anything with it? So we didn't bother to use the polygraph. Okay? So we have to be here locally very aware of what we're doing, and it's, as I said, a very confusing landscape because we don't know whether we're within the law in terms of using the polygraph. When can we really use it, not use it? Are we going to spend all this money and then, you know, it's not going to be admissible? So again, from an HR standpoint, we will have to exercise great caution because it cannot be the ultimate tool that can be used for decisions, neither pre-employment nor after employment, because of the legality of it, etc. So as we face the challenges of scamming, corruption, and all of the pressures that might be put on us in terms of our needs to get global work, we will have to be very cautious, and we'll have to really understand that this cannot be even a part and should not be a part of a standard test for employment. So that is one of the dilemmas that we face from an HR perspective. So it will be interesting to see what happens as the whole landscape evolves and whether the law will change. And I will look forward to hearing what Mr. Reid has to say with regards to how can we really use this from an HR perspective.
I'm a labor lawyer, industrial relations consultant, and I've been practicing for 39 years. I know give comfort to, to the chairman. I'm not as great as you are, chairman, but you know, we're getting there. And let me say this, that the use of polygraph tests is a challenging area in industrial relations, in labor law. But I believe very strongly that polygraph testing is not hocus pocus. You know, it's not a sham. It's not fraudulent. There is something there. But my position, I think, was really stated, perhaps inadvertently, by Captain Bewry, his last statement, which is that no adverse decision should be taken solely on the basis of a polygraph test. And that is really my position on it. I've had experience of seeing these tests conducted. I know of no case where someone was failed a test. It just turned out that the test was wrong. You know, usually it points eventually to other evidence which confirm what the test has found out. It would be great if polygraph testing was infallible. Then a lot of our problems could be solved. In elections, you know, some questions could be put to political contenders and it would save us all a lot of trouble. In the United States, perhaps we wouldn't have either President Trump or President Clinton at all. Locally again, if we're in a situation where, and I noticed that you know, a division of police have identified pastors and policemen as being culpable of certain offenses, then if we had a sort of annual renewal, we could merely ask the question, pastor or superintendent, in the last 12 months since your last polygraph test, have you had sex with a minor? And that will take care of that, if these tests are infallible. I hope that one day we could really get to that point. I think it will make life a lot easier and simpler, but we're not there. And therefore, my position, as I said before, is that no adverse decision should be taken solely on the basis of the result of a polygraph test. Now, we heard a lot of discussions about what people can do in tests. Again, I have had experience, and this is not scientific, as either Inspector Shakes or Captain Bewry or two professors could indicate. This is just my anecdotal experience and evidence. But I've had evidence of, or experience of seeing persons who are, I would describe, cool as cucumber, and who scoff at the test, and who say, you know, management really believe in this foolishness, and they take the test, and the test shows that they're lying, and come along with that evidence which helps to deal with their case. So I don't know if they're a psychopath, Professor Lives, but I've seen that too. So I believe that there is something there, and not just something, but a lot. It should be used as a tool in a tool bag, perhaps the sharpest tool, but never the only tool, and it should not be regarded as conclusive of the truth that you're trying to ascertain or the guilt. Let me put it this way. Until science can agree that we have reached a stage where the tests are infallible, would any of us be happy in a situation where someone has confessed to a murder? They have confessed. There's no other evidence. There's no evidence that anybody has found. They do a polygraph test, and that polygraph test says, yes, this person is speaking the truth. He is guilty of this murder. Would we think that that would be sufficient to send him to the gallows or to prison? I think we'd all say no. We have to find, we know who has done it, but we must find other evidence to corroborate this. And I think that indicates that we could never be in a situation where that is the only thing that we're relying on, and that is conclusive of guilt. In my view, it points the finger at someone in certain situations, and then it is our duty to unearth the corroborative evidence. We can't leave it just as that. It usually means that we're on the right track. You know, in industrial relations, and I heard some of the interesting situations that were being described just a while ago. Quite often, a group of employees are asked, will you take the lie detector test? This fraud has taken place, or embezzlement, you know? And usually they agree. Sometimes the agreement is on the fact that if you say no, then in fact that saves us taking the lie detector test, in my view. We just continue to try and find evidence because we know that it's probably you, right? Persons agree. And invariably, you know, when someone has failed that test, one is able to close in on other evidence which helps. That, I think, is the way to use that. In our jurisdiction, you can't go to the Industrial Disputes Tribunal or to the court and present solely the results of a polygraph test. It's not going to be accepted as justifying the dismissal. You can indicate in evidence that this has been done and this was the result, but you can't ask the tribunal to rule that as a result of that, this employee was justifiably dismissed. What you must be able to prove is that having gotten that result, you have worked and you have found the other indices of guilt or culpability, and you are now able to present that as well. And when the entire picture is presented, and I don't think there's any divisional tribunal who would be bold enough to say that they were influenced positively by the results of the test, because that may probably lead to the impeachment of the award. But I assure you that it will help in your case being accepted. I represent both employers and employees in my practice. And when employees have asked me this question as to whether they should agree, so I usually say, well, it depends on whether you're guilty or not. That usually is my answer. Because I am fairly confident that the test is going to indicate guilt or innocence, just based on my own experience. But the fact is that, as well in our jurisdiction, no one can really be compelled in the private sector to take tests. There are situations where employees have agreed as part of their contract of employment, both for things like body searches and polygraph testing. And if it's a contractual obligation that they have agreed to, then of course that will be a matter of the normal routine. But normally where that doesn't exist, then the consent of the employee is going to be required. My experience has been that quite often it comes because of the adverse inference that if you say, no, I will not take this test, that it's sort of a signal which, you know, will prompt further investigation, which may, in the fullness of time, establish your guilt. So then there's a balance of the rights of the employees and the rights of the employees, as was indicated earlier. We look at the jurisdiction, which I think is well known for the use of a polygraph test, which is the United States of America. And it is quite true. They used the test extensively in public service, in police work, in national security. But they have put constraints on the private sector employees. There's an act they call the Employee Polygraph Protection Act. The Employee Polygraph Protection Act, you know, and it prohibits most private employers from using lie detector tests either for pre-employment screening or during the course of employment. Employers generally may not require or request any employee or job applicant to take a lie detector test. But it does make some exceptions. I think was pointed out earlier, where there's some investigation into embezzlement or serious fraud, which shows that the employer, you know, has lost a lot of money, serious economic loss. There's some exceptions there where that can be done. But again, normally there has to be consent. But the fact that in that jurisdiction, there's still that break on the use of polygraph tests in the private sector. Must make us aware that we have to be cautious about how we move in this area. I don't think that we can move from a situation where we use it as a tool to point to guilt or culpability and to indicate that this is going to be the basis of a dismissal or a denial of promotion or denial of a job. It really is a tool in a bag of tools that we must use, whether in terms of determining someone's culpability, in terms of the possibility of termination of employment, someone's suitability for hiring, someone's suitability for promotion. And I think that once we keep within those parameters, we're on safe ground. We are not, and I know the presentations by Captain Bewry and Inspector Shakes are really compelling and quite persuasive. And in my view, they're probably absolutely correct. But I think that until we reach the stage where science, and I say science, and I don't mean Minister Montague's science. I mean the science which this university concerns itself with, is agreed that we have reached a stage where this test is infallible and can be relied on conclusively, then this is the approach that we should take. Perhaps the sharpest tool, as I say, in the bag of tools, but in the bag of tools. And once that's the approach, the police are doing a great job, I think, in terms of what they are doing. They're providing scientific evidence, in my view, of how it can be used. And they have a little bit more control of that situation. I hope that one day they will just be able to apply the test to every member of the force, every 6 months. And maybe, all our reservations about how the police force operates may be put to rest. So I wish them all the luck and hope that they get to that point as well. But as I said, until these things come a little bit closer and clearer, the best approach is one where we use this. But make no mistake about it. It is not fraudulent, in my view. And this is my personal view, It is not hocus pocus. It is not smoke and mirrors. There is something there, something very substantial there. I thank you.
Okay, I think that we have completed the panelists, and we probably have a little time over for questions from the floor. But before that, I have 3 questions to ask. I've been doing some reading too on polygraph, and I notice that people are acquiring, as private individuals, polygraph, so that several wives are buying their own machines and doing their polygraphing at home. My question is this legal?
First of all, I'd like to thank Mr. Reid for the endorsement. I think Mr. Shakes did an excellent job of explaining how the polygraph works. I hope that Professor Lips and my good friend
Professor
Abel will be, when they leave here, they'll be our disciples and speak well of the polygraphy. But a couple of things I just want to point out. The polygraph has been around for a number of years. The first instrument was actually built in 1921. So it's been around for nearly 100 years. And please note the use of the term instrument. I don't use box. I don't refer to it as the machine. It's an instrument. All right. So, and it's for good reason why we refer to it in that manner. I am happy that we have the Jamaica Constabulary Force has embraced the use of the polygraph, because when I started out, I was often referred to as the Obia man, All right. All right. What I was doing at the time was considered hocus pocus. In fact, I remember in 2003 I had to write an article in the Gleaner. All right. Clarifying the comments of a police sergeant by the name of David White. At the time, he was the chairman of the Police Federation. He is on record to have said that polygraph doesn't work on black people because of our ancestral links to slavery. Well, I had to explain to the good gentleman that 99% of my examinees were black, and it worked exceedingly well on black people, as it does on white people and various other shades of people. All right. The thing I also would like to point out is that the polygraph, no polygraph is done without it being recorded. All right. It is video recorded. All right. As I indicated earlier, I've done over 7,000 persons. Every one of those tests has been recorded. All right. I have never been sued. All right, for any malpractice or defamation of character. And as I indicated earlier, I was a skeptic before I went to the school. And having done these tests for over a number of years, I have now I am comfortable with the procedure, with the science that supports it. In fact, there are two cases I want to share with you. In 2004, a businesswoman lost $1 million at her business place. She asked me to test 16 employees. As far as she was concerned, every one of them had opportunity to steal the $1 million. Only, in fact, because she was spending so much money, she said, she made it a little more difficult for me, because not only did she want to find out who stole the $1 million, she also wanted to know what else they were stealing from her. Well, I'm here to tell you, all 16 of them admitted to stealing something from her. Only one of the 16 failed this specific question regarding the $1 million. The police were called in, the money was recovered. All right, and I have a testimony. I have a testimonial to that from the good lady. Now, there was another case where a young man was dismissed from his job. All right, he was found guilty by the company of stealing. All the evidence pointed to him. Apparently, the money, when they checked the computer records, it was his logging ID that was used. Evidently, he did not protect his logging ID. Somebody, according to him, impersonated him on the computer and was able to access the cash. All right. By this time, he was dismissed. He came to me and said, "I am innocent. I'm willing to pay for the polygraph test to exonerate myself." I spoke with the company, and I collected my money up front. So don't want anyone to feel as if that was going to have any undue influence on the outcome. He passed the test. In fact, he provided information as to whom he believed may have stolen the money. I was afforded the opportunity of testing that person. That person admitted to stealing the money. So it's not, I've heard a lot of people believe it's an anti-worker device. Clearly that's not the case. All right? And my reason for getting involved is because I suffered at the hands of a fraudist. All right? That nearly put me out of business. Now, can you imagine you're running a security guard company and you send somebody to someone's place of business only to hear that the guard who you sent there to protect is stealing from the client? You can imagine how much money I got paid for that service. All right? And that's how I got involved in the polygraph. And as Inspector Sheikh said, it's not cheap, but one thing I can assure you is that the deterrent factor is incalculable. All right? Once you start it, it will have a chilling effect on some of the persons who may be inclined to borrow things that don't belong to them and forget to return it. Thank you.
I have two questions still to ask, and Professor Basil has a question. The question that I have to ask is about the cost. How much does it cost? And let me get out the second question. How much does it cost to do one polygraph if I want to contract you to do one polygraph? What would be the average cost? And the second question is, before you get to the diagnostic, if you have a confession, can that confession be used in court?
The average rate is between $15,000 and $25,000 per person. All right, so that's a ballpark. Yeah, it's not cheap. All right, but I still believe it's money well spent. All right, and the other question was?
Jamaica. A confession.
All right, no, that's Jamaican money, please. Jamaican money. All right, if you're willing to pay US, then think about $200 US. All right, but the figures I was quoting was Jamaican dollars. All right, 25,000 top end. I mean, and at the bottom end you might get it done for 15. Chances are, if you're getting it for $15,000, you're probably it's because it's considered a volume discount you're getting. Regarding the confessions, I mean, confessions is not. I mean, I used to keep accurate records when I was allowed to do the post-test interview. Now, the post-test interview is when you confront the person with the results, and it's not every client wants that. But where I've been allowed to do the post-test interviews with those obviously who have failed, at least 40% have confessed. Those confessions are admissible. In fact, there's precedents. I also have written opinions from the Myers, Fletchers, and Gordon, and Don Cox and Orrick, which I can provide. All right, so you don't have to worry. But I am on record, and it wasn't a misstatement. All right, I am the first person to tell my clients, do not fire this person simply because they failed a polygraph test. Find other evidence to support the findings. And that's not often too difficult, because trust me, people will talk.
My question is, given the high confidence which seems to be associated with the use of polygraph tests, why is it that the American Psychological Association and the British Psychological Association are so opposed to it? I have a follow-up question. The discussion about the use of polygraphs in recruitment, especially in terms of trying to weed out bad apples in the workplace. My question from a statistical standpoint, the apparent accuracy, is the apparent accuracy associated with the fear of being tested rather than the results from the polygraph test? In other words, if I know that something is going to happen and there's a likelihood that I can detect it, then I may change my behavior or something, or I may do something which may lead to a change in my behavior. I know you identified it in your presentation as one of the outcomes, but my question is that as a result of the polygraph, or is it as a result of the fact that this thing is actually happening and you're responding to it? That's my contention. The third point that third one. And I like the last presenter. I think his presentation was spot on in my view, because what it does, it shows that from the research that you should never use the polygraph test on their own. But my question, what I also Googled was a number of cases where polygraph tests led to wrongful conviction of persons, and that in part may explain why there's some skepticism. But my question is here, how far, in your mind, I think both of you, in your mind, should we go in the use of polygraph tests? Should we, like the Americans, adapt them, say, for death penalty cases? I know we've heard the position from the lawyer, but I would like to hear your position on that. Thank you.
As was indicated earlier, we cannot operate on the basis of polygraph alone. And for even the organizations in the US now, their aversion to polygraph is, as I indicated earlier, it is based on the diagnostic test itself. There is much worth in that discourse prior to the actual test. There is much worth. Now, when a person comes in, and let me use the police recruits as an example. When these individuals come into a polygraph setting and they are engaged in that 2.5-hour discourse, there is a lot of information that is gleaned, as I said earlier, and this is before they are introduced to the diagnostic aspect of the test itself. There is no stress, there is no coercion. The test itself is voluntary, and they're told this on camera. As a matter of fact, they're told that they can leave at any time they want. So there is no stress on the part of the individual. They are not coerced. And I think this is a point that we need to send home, to, you know, just to clarify that point. So the National Research Council, as I mentioned earlier, its findings prompted the APA, American Polygraph Association, to do their own research. And they went about and they looked at all the validated techniques. So there is just like in Jamaica, where we're having this kind of discourse where there is a version, there are persons who are proponents of polygraph. The very same thing is happening in the US now. But there is scientific evidence. But I don't think there's enough of a conversation around the discourse before the actual diagnostic test. There's too much focus on the diagnostic portion alone. And that is the contention I have. Every time you hear about polygraph's accuracy, when you hear about its acceptance or admissibility in court, it is based on the diagnostic portion. I have done polygraph tests where, well, not in Jamaica's, not in our jurisdiction, in the Eastern Caribbean, where persons have actually confessed to crimes. And it was admissible in court. The person actually went to court and pled guilty. So the whole construct of polygraph, it affords you that atmosphere where persons are led to self-disclose without any form of stress, without any form of pressure on the individual, contrary to what everyone might believe.
I believe the reason the American Psychological Association, the British Psychological Association, and the National Academy of Sciences are so vehemently opposed is the fact that they're questioning, is it the interrogation before that detects lies, or is it the procedure? Okay? So that is one reason. The other reason is they actually looked at all three societies at the meta-analysis done by the American Polygraphy Association. And meta-analysis isn't simply about scoring it. It's also looking at the quality of the research. And they found that most of the quality of the research is very, very poor. In fact, one of the leading persons cited, I believe it's Leonard Sachs, an applied social psychologist, was asked in court about it. And he said, essentially, there is no way to validate whether someone is lying or not. You have no criterion. Confession? No, not confession. There is no way to validate whether someone is lying or not lying. And as well, they have done research to show that people can actually distort responses. There have been a very well-cited study that instructed, they had 120 participants, 20 people were not guilty, okay, they were completely innocent, 100 guilty people, and they instructed them in 3 simple techniques that could be used that would be undetectable to a polygraph examiner. 50% of the guilty people fooled the polygrapher, okay? Half of the people could. And this is a controlled scientific study, okay? The other factor that I think comes up, and it's a human rights factor, well, while people may on the surface be said, no, you do not have to do that, are you likely to be hired by the police if you say no? What if you are familiar with the evidence and you say, no, I don't think this is a particularly good procedure? Would you hire the person? So many times people are actually coerced into doing a polygraph because of the association of not doing it. Okay? It's kind of like if you're asked by the police, "Do you want to talk to me?" You have the right to remain silent. But there is the assumption that if you don't talk, you're guilty. Well, actually, no, many times, even in, okay, that is the problem with the error in the procedure, if it is inconclusive. The biggest factor, I think, is that what seems to be valid is the pre-assessment, not the actual assessment, not the actual polygraph itself. It is the procedure before, and the induction of fear into people. And from a human rights perspective, do you need to incite fear in people? Is it ethical to incite fear in people? Do you need to incite fear in people to detect crime? I have worked as a program evaluator. 3 times I've had people confess crimes to me. And they did it without fear. They did it because they trusted me. They didn't think what they were doing was wrong. It was seriously wrong. In one episode, they drugged all the patients of a hospital systematically, and then organized all the nurses to lie, to keep the patients drugged. In another episode, a man took money from the mentally handicapped so he could buy a car. I didn't need to induce fear in people. All I had to do was get people to be comfortable. So if you're inducing fear in people, fundamentally that is a violation of human rights, unethical. So you could see that from all the polygraphers, they've clearly said one thing. It is not the test. It is the pre-test. It is the pre-interrogation that determines it. It is not the test itself. Okay. So the fear factor, that is why the American Psychological Association said the entire procedure was a fear detection, not a lie detection. Thank you.
Well, Professor Lips and I are going to have to agree to disagree, because a couple of things are the use of the term interrogate. All right. I don't know. I think I can speak for all the polygraphers here. What we conduct before the test is a pre-test interview. All right. In fact, you don't want, the whole purpose of the interview is to establish rapport. You want to calm the, as you rightly says, everybody coming to do a polygraph test is going to be nervous. I mean, if I was to follow what Professor has just said, then everybody would fail. All right. The pre-test interview is what prepares the examinee for the test. You have to conduct an interview, and it has to be non-threatening. All right? Non-threatening. All right? You review the questions beforehand, so there's no surprise element. You explain to them how it works. All right? And then you test. And I guarantee that if the person has stolen or committed some sexual deviant act, the polygraph instrument is going to detect that. In fact, we've heard people make mention of this EPPA, all right? The Employers Polygraph Protection Act. It was passed in 1988. That's right. And the reason for that, they don't know, I'll tell you why, is because of abuse. They were in the States. Every Tom, Dick, and Harry was polygraphing people. They were polygraphing McDonald's workers. In order for them to get a job to flip a burger, you had to pass a polygraph test. And that was the reason why they put a stop to it. What is interesting, the federal government requires the use of polygraph. Exactly. The police, every police department in the United States requires their officers to pass the polygraph for pre-employment purposes. All right, there are some exceptions. I find it interesting that those companies that are in the business of transporting money, all right, are exempt from the dictates of the EPPA. The pharmaceutical industry is also exempt. And you know what is a biggie for me? The biggest users or use of polygraph in the United States is post-sexual offender testing.
Yes.
Can you imagine? I mean, that is something that we should be embracing, given what we are unearthing or learning of in recent times. All right? In the States, having served time, so as to ensure that you don't reoffend, you're required to do periodic polygraph tests. And I am going to sit here and expect, I mean, I realize I'm not going to convince the goodly professor. What I am going to invite him to do is come and witness a polygraph test. And maybe he'll have a better appreciation of what we do.
Sorry.
All right, regarding the fear, you mentioned, I hope I covered your points.
Yeah, but I just wanted to be clear. The points I made to him were all the points he raised by the British Psychological Association and the American. So these aren't his. I just wanted to make it. These aren't his points. But right. So I just wanted that to be made clear that it's not him. Right. But also another issue and here that he didn't bring, that came up in the study, was that the studies, that meta-analysis, I forgot to mention that they said that the results should not be generalized. If you look at all of the studies, in fact, and this is excluding people who have countermeasures. So I'm not suggesting by any means that one should not use them, but I'm saying that one has to recognize that the issues that are raised by Professor Lips are a real and serious problem, and that they are being clearly documented by researchers in the field who do this for a living. All right, just wanted to make this up.
I also do psychometric tests. All right? Half of the persons I polygraph, I also give them a psychometric test. And you know what I have discovered? The polygraph and the psychometric test often support one another. In fact, I will tell you that a polygraph test is actually more accurate than a psychometric test, because I have been subjected to a psychometric test, and anybody with any intelligence can quickly deduce what it is that they're seeking to test, and you answer appropriately. All right? But the other thing I want to point out is that when I hear the police force claiming that, or citing that 30% of their new recruits are failing, all right, the question that begs to be asked is, one, what were the questions that they were failing? Because we don't know. All right. Secondly, all right, in the private sector, the failure rate is a lot higher. In fact, the further west you go, the worse the results are. I mean, I've had clients, and I know that Dr. Hall will verify it. I mean, I've tested 7 people, and all 7 failed. And the question that they're failing is the one regarding scamming. We have a problem. We have a big problem in Jamaica. And this is one of the few tools that we have in the tool pan to assist us. I am not recommending that personally speaking, I am happy that I don't have to go to court and testify, because I probably wouldn't be here at this panel, because by now somebody would have killed me. All right? I would be considered somebody who, in other words, I would be, the reality is that I would be somebody who they would have to neutralize. So I am happy that all I'm required to do is come, ensure I get someone's written consent, offer my opinion, point my client in a particular direction where they can find the evidence, and I have done a damn good day's work for which I believe I ought to be paid. All right? I don't want it to reach the level where I am now required to go in front of in a witness box and attest to the infallibility, because I know that it's not 100% accurate. The most we can expect is 95. And that's why most of us, when we do these tests, we make certain that we are, you know, in other words, we put our best foot forward, because any polygraph examiner will tell you, you're as good as your last test. All right, we're not going to cut corners. And one of the reasons why we formed the Jamaica Polygraph Association is to ensure that there's some self-regulatory body. I wasn't the first polygrapher in Jamaica. All right? There was a guy in Montego Bay who had half a polygraph instrument doing tests. He wasn't even testing for blood pressure and heartbeat. All he was testing was for the galvanic skin response to perspiration. And he was earning a good, we had to put him out of business. All right? So rest assured that we're doing our damnedest to ensure that we live up to the high expectations that our clients require of us. And I am happy that there are people like Professor Lips out there to keep us on our toes.
Okay, thank you. There is just one point I didn't raise, and it's a small point, okay? It has to do really with the evidence the polygraphers are presenting. They're talking about people who have committed crimes or suspected of a crime. The issue I raise is the predictive validity of lie detector tests. If you're using a lie detector test as a pre-screening procedure to detect people who are likely to become criminals, there has been no research on that. There has been research that looks at people who have committed crimes, but you have not looked at the prediction of future criminal acts. That is the central issue. That is one of the issues why the APA and the British Psychological Society object to the use of polygraphs in personnel selection, is because there is no predictive validity. There may be reliability between people, but as any good psychometrician will tell you, a reliable instrument isn't necessarily a valid instrument. Okay? So thank you.
I want to respond to my good learned professors. He's correct. Invariably, the people who do well on the polygraph test are the ones who are willing to make confessions. I mean, there are many instances out there where the person, as you said, the pre-test admissions probably would have disqualified them for consideration. But there have been many instances where, having made these admissions, we test the person, they pass the test. And I will back for that person, and I will tell the would-be employer, it is better to work with the devil you know than the devil you don't know. All right? So, and I get comfort from Scripture. Proverbs 28, verse 13. He who sins and conceals their sins does not prosper. He who confesses and renounces their sins finds mercy. So we're not saying that because you make admissions, you necessarily have to be disqualified. In fact, those are the people that probably will give you an honest day's work. And having been a former intelligence officer, all right, I wish to make one correction. In order for me to serve in the military intelligence unit, dishonesty was not an asset. All right? I just want to clear that up because, all right, dishonesty was not an asset for being an intelligence officer.
Ladies and gentlemen, on your behalf, I want to thank the panelists, all of them, for a very lively discussion. We know nothing is settled between the panelists, but I'm sure that you can make your own judgments, and we hope to carry on this discussion a little further at a later date. Thank you very much.